Parshas Kedoshim, the Torah section referred to as Kedoshim, is one of the most mitzvah-laden sections of the Torah. Over 10% of all of the 613 commandments can be found in this week's Torah portion. But not only does it contain a large quantity of commandments, but many of these commandments are fundamental. Of course, the most fundamental of all, arguably, is the one that commands us to love our fellow as ourselves. But many of the other commandments are likewise fundamental to Judaism. And indeed, the very name, Kedoshim, be holy, that's what all of Judaism revolves around, being holy. The trick here is, what is the definition of holy? So Rashi explains that holiness here means sexual holiness, not behaving in promiscuous ways. But the Torah doesn't give those examples as holiness. The first examples the Torah gives are honoring or respecting one's mother and father, ish imo v'aviv tiro, and the second one is shapsosai tishmoro, you shall guard or keep my Shabbos. So it would seem that when the Torah follows the commandment to be holy, with the ones about honoring or respecting parents and keeping Shabbos, that those two are expressions of holiness. And here's where Judaism is unique, because we generally understand holiness in a religious and a spiritual context as being totally spiritual. The more spiritual one is, one would say, the more holy they are. The less one is involved with the physical world, the less one engages in materialistic pursuits, the more holy one is. So, for example, if you have a rabbi versus a businessman, and you would ask, well, without knowing anything else about them, which one is more holy? You would say probably the rabbi. Because what does the rabbi do all day? He studies Torah, he teaches Torah, he leads services, or whatever it is. The business person is wheeling and dealing. Obviously, honestly, without fraud and so on and so forth, but still they're not engaged in anything spiritual. But that's true in a very limited way. Yes, on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, we are more spiritual. We're like angels. That's why we get dressed up in white, symbolizing the angelic character that we possess. We're divorced from the physical world. We don't eat or drink. We don't engage in different enjoyable behaviors because we are detached from the physical world. That's a holy day, obviously. But what happens after Yom Kippur? We can't say we're as holy as Yom Kippur. But that's only partially true, because Judaism has a different version of what true holiness is. True holiness does not mean necessarily divorce from the physical world. That's just one expression of it. The other expression, which is even more pervasive in Judaism, is transforming everything we do into something holy. To use an example, there's nothing more prosaic than walking down a supermarket aisle to buy food. Well, is that a holy experience? What if someone's going to be in a trance state where they're meditating on the supermarket's spiritual character? No, it's a very mundane, very prosaic exercise. But yet it's not, from the point of view of Judaism. If the person is walking down the aisle looking for a kosher insignia on a jar of pickles, whatever it may be, then that person is engaged in a holy behavior. That person is actually doing something no less holy than the ultimate prayer of Yom Kippur, because they are taking this very mundane act, devoid, you would think, of anything spiritual, of going to a supermarket, walking down the aisle, that transforming that into a way of serving and connecting to God, which can be more holy than being connected to God. Another example would be in the same supermarket, it's before Shabbat, it's before the Sabbath, and you're looking for something to buy that will enhance the glory the delight and the pleasure of Shabbos. That is a holy activity. And therefore, the two examples the Torah gives, in addition to the simple meaning that it means chastity and purity in one's relationships, as Rashi explains, but it also means, it includes having respect for one's parents. People would think respect for parents, that's has nothing to do with God. It's nothing to do with holiness. No, it has very much to do, because as the Talmud says, there are three partners in a person: the father, the mother, and God. When you respect one partner, you're respecting the others as well. When you disrespect one, you're disrespecting the other partners as well. So, even though parents are physical beings, parents nevertheless are expressions of and partners with God. And by honoring them, actually the term here is yira, which is more revering them, respecting them. Honoring, which is in the Ten Commandments, is defined more as realizing and appreciating their value by giving them things, feeding them, taking them places, whereas the commandment over here is showing respect, not interrupting them, and so on. So you're dealing with physical parents, born of flesh and blood, born of normal parents. They're totally physical, but you're honoring them, you're respecting them, is a way of elevating this human relationship into something divine, into something holy. Same thing would be true about marriage. Marriage is not just a physical thing. Marriage, when it's done properly, within the context of Jewish law, marriage becomes very holy. In fact, the Hebrew word for marriage is kiddushin, that which makes you holy. Marriage is holy. The same thing is true with, we drink wine. Wine is a symbol of hedonistic pleasure. Yet, what do we call the blessing that we recite over wine Friday night and during holidays? We call that kiddush, the same root as kiddushin, holiness. And as I think it was Adin Steinsaltz pointed out, which is the holiest book of the entire Bible, of the entire Tanakh. The holiest book is Shir HaShirim, the Song of Songs, which is a love song. It expresses the love between a husband and wife. It's a metaphor for the love between God and us. But the fact that it chooses to use a physical metaphor demonstrates that the things that relate to marriage are indeed considered to be holy. And Shir HaShirim, it's a song. Music is again seen sometimes as a sign of hedonistic attitudes. Yet Shir HaShirim is the holiest of all the books. And the next example is observing the Shabbos. Shabbos we observe not by fasting. On the contrary, you're not supposed to fast on Shabbos. We don't observe it by divorcing ourselves from the physical world. Yes, we spend time praying. Prayers of Shabbos are longer than the weekday prayers. We study Torah on Shabbos ideally, but yet Shabbos we're obligated to have 3 meals, and the meals we're supposed to enjoy. Shabbos oneg Shabbat, and delighting in the Shabbat is one of the primary responsibilities that a Jew has in Shabbat. It's very physical, pleasurable, but yet the pleasure is uplifted to becoming holy. Now, the Torah concludes with, after it talks about respecting one's mother and father, it says you should and observe the Sabbath as Ani Hashem Elokecha, I am God, your God. Why does the Torah have to add those words? So Rashi explains that the reason why the Torah juxtaposes respecting parents to observing Shabbos is to teach us that if your parents tell you to break the Shabbos, you're not supposed to listen to them. Why is that? But the Torah commands you to listen to your parents, to have respect for them. If they tell you to do something, wouldn't it be disrespectful not to do it? And the answer is, Ani Hashem Elokechem, I am God, your God. As Rashi says, you and your father are obligated to honor me. Therefore, you can't listen to them to go against any of the things that I tell you, because they too are obligated to follow my commandments. So even though you're supposed to listen to what your parents tell you, if they tell you to go against Shabbos or against any of the commandments of the Torah, you're not supposed to listen to them. Now, the simple understanding of that is, why shouldn't you listen to them? Because if you listen to them, then they caused you to sin. By causing you to sin, it makes their sin so much greater. One of the most evil leaders that the Jews ever had was a man called Yerovam ben Nevat, Jeroboam. And what was so evil about him? That he is chata, he sinned, vehechti es harabiv, he caused others to sin. In other words, his evil was not just his own sins, but the fact that he caused others to sin. So when you listen to your parents who tell you to go against the law, your parents are now not only guilty of doing it themselves, but they're guilty of corrupting you. That's the greatest dishonor you can bring to your parents. So by listening to your parents, let's put it the other way around, by not listening to the parents who tell you to break the Shabbos or any other commandment, you are actually giving them honor. You're preserving their honor. You're demonstrating that their influence was a positive influence. But on the other hand, if you listen to them, you are bringing them dishonor because they are now going to be labeled as those who caused others to sin in addition to their own sins. That's why the law that says you're supposed to not listen to your parents when they tell you to do things that are unlawful, where's that law mentioned? It's mentioned in the laws of honoring your parents, because that's the way you honor them, by not listening to them. You honor them by doing what's right, and therefore they will get the credit that it was their influence that caused you to do the right thing, and that will bring honor to them. That's one understanding, but then there's a deeper way of understanding. Why do we honor parents? As I mentioned before, because they are God's partners. When you don't observe the Shabbos, and by extension, all of the commandments, but especially Shabbos, you are denying God's partnership in this world. Because it says, we're taught in the Talmud, that whenever we observe Shabbos, we become partners with God in the act of creation. Because what is Shabbos? Shabbos is when we declare God is the creator of heaven and earth. And because he's the creator of heaven and earth, everything in the world is God's. And that's what we proclaim by observing Shabbos. He rested on the seventh day, but he created the world in the preceding 6 days. So Shabbos is when we become God's partners. But if we break the Shabbos, what happens then is that partnership is compromised. We destroy that partnership. So the parents lose their special status as being God's partners. You know, animals also have parents, but they're not partners with God in your creation. They don't qualify as partners, even though it's God's power that gives the animals the ability to reproduce. You can't call them partners with God in creation because it's not voluntary. It's part of nature. It's instinctive. But when a human being gets married and a human being produces children, that is something that a human being keeps Shabbos. We become partners in God's creation and partners with God in creating the child. So when a person listens to his parents to do something unlawful, particularly not observing the Shabbos, that means we disrupt and compromise and degrade the partnership, and therefore we bring dishonor to our parents because they're no longer part of that partnership. And if they're not part of the partnership, what gives them their unique status? The unique status is only because they are partners. One of the commandments in this week's Torah portion is to rebuke our fellow. That if you see someone doing something wrong, you're supposed to rebuke them. You're supposed to tell them, excuse me, but what you're doing is against the Torah, and you should desist from doing it. Now, of course, that's a commandment, but a person has to use a little bit of discretion to know how to rebuke someone. And Rambam makes it very clear that when you rebuke someone, you have to do it gently, with sensitivity. You can't just go to the person and clobber them over the head. You wicked person, look what you did. And you're going to burn in hell for this. There are people who do that, to fire and brimstone. That was done, unfortunately, by many rabbis before the Baal Shem Tov. And the Baal Shem Tov came along and he discredited that whole approach. Said you can't use that approach. And someone may argue, but that approach works. I know of a rabbi, I'm not going to mention any names, who says that they use that approach and that's what gets people to become observant. No, that's not the right approach. Once the Baal Shem Tov came, he changed that whole approach from fire and brimstone to love, showing how much God loves us and how could we go against a loving God. So it's based not on fear, it's based on love. We're not strong enough. Starting with it's hard to say when it started. It started with the destruction of the temple, but even more in more recent history, starting with the pogroms of Khmelnytsky, who massacred in the 17th century tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of Jews. That was the greatest massacre since the destruction of the temple and until the Holocaust, of course. And from that point on, the Jewish people have been downtrodden and have and are in need to be uplifted with love. So when you rebuke your fellow, yes, rebuke, absolutely, but rebuke with love, rebuke gently and mildly. But sometimes you have to use tough love. After you tried everything else and it didn't work, and it's someone who you have influence over, and not just pick up a person in the street and start shouting at that person, but it's someone who you have influence and they misbehave, and then you have a right to go to the next level using a little bit of tough love. Now, there are 2 points. Number one, the first point is that's the method the Torah says you're not allowed to disrespect even the sinner. You're not supposed to embarrass the sinner. At least initially you shouldn't embarrass them. But there's a second point, that it's more effective. So someone will argue, no, it's not more effective. I know, and again, going back to that rabbi that I'm not going to mention his name, who's on the internet, who always preaches fire and brimstone and you're going to burn in hell and so on and so forth. And it does work on certain people, and it will jolt them and make them change. But number one, you're also hurting them. You don't know what the effects will be of all this negative energy. Number two, it's very unlikely to last very long because it's not internalized. It's not because the person appreciates the beauty of the mitzvah or how degrading the sin is. All they know is, I'm going to get punished and God's going to strike me down or I'll burn in hell. This is not going to last very long. And if you fail, the Alter Rebbe in his classic work, the Tanya, says, if you use the other method and you fail, you're left without any mitzvah. You didn't accomplish anything because the end result, which to some people justifies the means, you didn't succeed with, and the means is not worth anything. But if you work on changing a person with love, even if you didn't succeed in the end of bringing them closer to Judaism, you fulfilled the mitzvah of showing love to your fellow Jew. So in that case, using the soft method has 2 advantages. Number one, it is the right way to do things, not to hurt someone. And number two, it's the more effective way. It's more effective in the long run. Maybe in the short run it isn't. The Alter Rebbe, in the very front page of the Tanya, talks about 2 different approaches to changing. One approach is called the long and short route, or the first we'll start with the short and long route, or the long and short route. And there's a story in the Talmud where Rabbi Yeshua, the great sage, had to go to a certain city, and he comes to a fork in the road, and he didn't know which road to take, the right or the left, and a child tells him, well, if you take the right, it's a very short route, but it's long. If you take the left, it's very long, but it's short. Well, the rabbi hears, and usually we often hear the first thing you hear, oh, this is the short route. He takes the short route. When he gets to the city is blocked with barricades. You can't get in. So he retraces his steps, and he says to the child, you told me this is the short route. And he said, yes, it's the short route, but it's the long route. It's once you get there, you can't get in. The other route is a circuitous route. It takes you much longer, but you finally get there. And this connects to Passover that we just came from. The Torah tells us that when the Jews came to the sea, when they left Egypt, Vayasev Elikim, God took them in a circle. He took them through a circuitous route because he was concerned that if they see war with the Philistines, they might get cold feet and they'll run right back to Egypt. And the Midrash tells us the reason why we recline, which means not sitting straight, is because of God taking us in a roundabout way. How does that reconcile with the idea that reclining is an expression of freedom? So I think the answer is, yes, reclining is freedom, but what's freedom? Freedom is when the experience that you have endures, it penetrates, it infiltrates, it is integrated with you. If the experience of freedom is a shallow one, if it's a short-lived one, then it's not really freedom. If the Jews came out of Egypt and they would have taken the straightforward route, they were not ready to enter into Eretz Yisrael. There would have been wars, there would have been struggles, and they would have failed. By taking the circuitous route, it was the long road, but in the end they finally got there. Not everyone, even then not everyone got there, but eventually they got there. The Jewish people as a whole got to their destination. So what do we see from this? That sometimes the long route is really the shorter route. And the same thing can be said about rebuking someone, having influence over someone. If you take the short route, you're going to hit them over the head verbally and tell them how terrible they are and how they're going to be punished. It'll have effects, but the effects will be lost in the long run. It's the short but long route. Whereas if you use love, it takes longer, but we're not talking with machines, with computers. We're not automatons. We're human beings. A human being, you can't change overnight. I remember years ago there was a student who got inspired one day because of what he heard. I don't remember what it was. And he became observant overnight, totally observant. But it didn't last. That's not human. That's not normal. A human being has to process things. And sometimes it takes more time than others. So if you see you try to influence someone to become a better Jew, and it's taking a long time, don't be disappointed. Don't be disillusioned, because the process is just as important as the goal. The process is one of love, of bringing the person closer to you and closer to God. The success will come in the long run. So that's the two levels of rebuke. But then the Torah says that you will not bear iniquity, you will not bear a sin. What does that mean? So the Talmud explains that if you rebuke someone initially and you embarrass them in public, you have a sin. Sometimes you might think, I'm doing it for the sake of bringing them closer to Judaism, bringing them closer to God. But the truth is you're actually sinning because you're embarrassing them. And embarrassment is one of the worst crimes. Public embarrassment in particular is one of the worst crimes a person can commit. We know the 10 Commandments, the so-called 10 Commandments. They're really 10 statements, as I point out many times. So how do we read the 10 Commandments? We read them 1 through 5 and then 6 through 10. But there's another way the Midrash says we read the Commandments: 1 through to 7, 2 to 8, 3 to 9, 4 to 10. 1 to 6, 2 to 7, 3 to 8, 4 to 9, and 5 to 10. So what's the connection between the first commandment, I am God, your God, who was taking you out of the land of Egypt, to the one that says do not commit murder? So the answer is, when you embarrass someone, you're killing that person. Why are you killing them? Because the Talmud says it's like spilling their blood, because when a person becomes embarrassed, blood rushes away from their face, rushes to their face, and then withdraws and rushes. You turn colors, red and then white. The Talmud refers to embarrassing someone as whitening their face. And the Maharal, the great Jewish philosopher and Talmudist and leader and Kabbalist, explains that it's more than just a physical thing, that the blood is moving around, so it's called bloodshed, but you're destroying the person's humanity, you're destroying their dignity, you're destroying their godly image. That's why commandment number 6 is connected to commandment number 1, because if you really treat a human being as someone created in the image of God, you're affirming God himself, because every human being has that image of God. But if you embarrass someone, you're degrading them, You're taking away their dignity and their humanity and their godliness. That's the biggest crime you could commit. It's like tantamount to murder. And the Talmud explains that Tamar, the biblical daughter-in-law of Yehuda, of Judah, when she refused to publicize what Yehuda did, I'm not going to go into the details right now, she would have been, and if Yehuda had not admitted that he was involved, she would have been thrown into a fiery furnace, from which the Talmud derives the principle that you're better off putting yourself in a fiery furnace and dying rather than embarrassing someone in public. So what is it about embarrassing someone in public? Why is that so much worse than embarrassing them privately? That's also a sin, without a question, but it's not as bad as doing it in public. And the reason why it's worse in public is because when you embarrass someone in private, you're taking away their dignity as a human being, as an individual. But we also have another identity. We also have a communal identity. We're part of a nation. And when you destroy someone in public, you're destroying their communal identity, which is even more serious than just destroying their private individual identity. One other point. The most fundamental mitzvah, the one that Hillel tells this prospective convert who wants to hear the whole Torah on one foot, Hillel tells him what is hateful to you, don't do to others. The rest is, this is the whole Torah, the rest is commentary. What he said essentially was taking the commandment in this week's Torah portion, love your fellow as yourself, and presenting it in the negative. What you don't want people to do to you, don't do to others. Which means you should treat the other person like yourself. This is, Rashi quotes Rabbi Akiva, this is a major principle of Torah. So much of the Torah revolves around this principle. Now, the Torah, a little bit later, adds another commandment, v'yahavtem es hager, you have to love a convert to Judaism. A person who converts to Judaism according to halacha, according to Jewish law, is now a full-fledged Jew, and the Torah gives us a commandment to love him or her. So the question could be asked, why does the Torah have to repeat the commandment to love a convert? Once a person converts to Judaism, they're a full-fledged Jew. So they're included in the original commandment to love your fellow as yourself. Why does the Torah have to give us an additional commandment? And the simple answer is, it's for the purpose of emphasis. That you might think that a ger is maybe a second-class citizen and you don't have to love him as much. So the Torah says, no, he's not a second-class citizen. He's part of the Jewish community. But there's a deeper way of understanding the difference between these two commandments based on Maimonides' characterization of these two commandments. When it comes to loving your fellow as yourself, Maimonides in his Code of Law, Mishnah Torah, says, how do you fulfill that? By speaking positively about someone, by treating their money with respect. In other words, you have to behave in loving ways. If you love someone, you love yourself, you wouldn't allow certain things to be done to yourself or to the person whom you love, your parents, your children, your siblings, and your best friend. Well, that's how you should treat every Jew. You should treat them in a loving way. Now, it's definite, there's no question that the ultimate goal is that there should be true feelings of love. You should have this passion, not just act in a loving way. Because you can act in a loving way, you can talk nicely to someone, but you're really forcing yourself to do it. You really don't like that person. So the ultimate goal is to love them as yourself. And how do you reach that goal? Ultimately, the meditation that the Alter Rebbe in Tanya gives in chapter 32, which is Lev in Hebrew, the heart. It's the heart of the Tanya. And that is that you should reflect on the fact that we all share our soul. We have one common soul. We all come from the same source. So it's not like loving a stranger, it's loving yourself. It is literally loving yourself in terms of your soul. If your main focus is on your body and your body's interests, then you can only act in a loving way. But if your focus is on your soul, then you could actually begin to love that person. But that takes a lifetime of effort. So the mitzvah, translated in down-to-earth terms, act lovingly. Now, when it comes to loving a convert, this is what Maimonides writes. Loving a convert who has come to nestle under the wings of the Shekhinah, the divine presence, fulfills two positive commandments. One, for he is also included among the fellows whom we are commanded to love. And the other one is because he is a convert, and the Torah states, and you shall love the converts. Then he proceeds to define the commandment to love a convert in the following way. He commanded us concerning the love of the convert, just as he has commanded us concerning loving himself, as it says in Deuteronomy, and you shall love God your God. The Holy One, blessed he, himself loves converts, as it says in Deuteronomy, and he loves converts. And that's why we should love the convert. What is Maimonides saying here? In addition to the fact you have to love the convert the way you would love any Jew, born Jewish, which means you have to act lovingly to them, it is also another meditation, that you're loving God in essence. Because God has a special love for the convert, and by loving the convert, you're showing your love for God who loves the convert. So here the love is much more pronounced. It's not just acting lovingly and ultimately leading to an emotional love, passionate love. Here, the passionate love has to come very soon. You have to work on the passionate love even before you would reach that same passionate love for someone who was born Jewish. Just concluding on a note, we spoke before about embarrassment. Our whole golus, our whole exile, is a tragedy and an embarrassment that we are subjected to the pain of golus, of exile, that we're seeing so vividly in the world today with all the anti-Semitism, the suffering of the Jews in Israel, the soldiers, the hostages, and we pray to God that it should end very soon. But one way of looking at it is God also has to fulfill the 613 commandments. So says the Midrash, that whatever commandment he gives us, he observes himself. Well, God says we're not allowed to embarrass another person. God cannot keep us in exile. We have to come to God and plead with him. God, listen and follow your own teachings of Torah. You're not allowed to embarrass someone. And not only is it a private embarrassment, it's a public embarrassment. The whole Jewish people are embarrassed, even the Jews who are not specifically suffering, but they're part of the collective, and we are suffering as a people. And we come to God and say, God, please take us out of exile. Stop this public, universal embarrassment, and bring us Mashiach, rebuild the Beis Hamikdash, and gather all the Jews safely and securely in Eretz Yisrael under the guidance of Mashiach. In the presence of God, the Shekhinah shall be spread throughout the whole world, but particularly in Israel. Everyone have a good week. Tonight is Rosh Chodesh. We're starting the new month. It's still the last day of Nisan, and it says about Nisan, it's the most auspicious month for the redemption, just like we were redeemed from Egypt. We still have Mashiach has one day. He could still come in the month of Nisan, and we're not exaggerating, but this could happen any moment, whether we're prepared for it or not. So we're better off preparing for it.